Okay. And now for our next speaker, Tinsley Gallion will give our next talk entitled Mobile Devices for Early Literacy Intervention and Research with Global Reach. Thank you very much.
So I'm Tinsley Gallion. I'm going to hand off to my co-presenter partway through this, so don't be surprised when she comes up, Stephanie. This work was actually a collaboration between MIT Media Lab, where I'm an appointment, and Tufts University, where Stephanie's from, and Georgia State University. So to give you a little bit of context, there are about 157 million children on the planet who have no access to school or inadequate schools. About 60 million of them absolutely no access to school at all, no way to get to it. And the other 100 million are roughly in situations where the schools are wholly under-resourced. So they never learn to read. They're destined to kind of join the 770 million adults who are illiterate. These numbers are kind of self-reported from countries, so our suspicion is that they're actually low. Of those 770 million adults, 2/3 of them are women or girls, and 75% of them are concentrated in only 10 countries, much to our surprise. The net result of that is estimated to be about 1.2 trillion on the global GDP for those people not being literate. And that doesn't take into account the additional cost of services that are having to be provided to these people over the course of their lifetimes. We know that literacy provides avenues for longer, healthier lives, increased empowerment, and the ability to kind of engage in civic participation. So it's in this context that we asked this question, which was, can children learn on their own? And more specifically, could we give them mobile devices with early literacy content on it, and could they develop early literacy skills, knowing that literacy is a kind of foundational skill for all subsequent learning? So this picture, which you'll see more pictures in a few minutes, is a young woman in at about 11,000 feet up in a very rural village in Ethiopia where no one's literate in the local language. So the platform that we created to do this work, I'll give you a quick overview. We refer to it as a Curious Learning Platform. It takes content mostly from third-party content developers, brings that into the platform, then packages that up into an interface which only gives access to that content, provides that to our deployments and deployment partners. Every place that we deploy, we have a partner on the ground who's connected to the community and is able to manage the devices and the access to them and monitor them. From that, data flows back, both usage data and assessment data, which Stephanie will talk about in more detail. And from our system, that becomes available to the researchers. Researchers use that data. And from that, look at different ways that new technologies, new theories of learning, and what new types of content may be helpful to impact the learning trajectory. And then we feed that information back out to the people who are doing content development too. So this virtuous loop of interactivity to try to optimize the learning experience is what we're talking about wanting to try to create here, not only for the sake of optimizing learning, but also for optimizing our ability to research rapidly on a very large scale. So how can we dovetail research and intervention at the same time in a way to increase the impact of both? So remote villages. There's 3 case studies we're going to kind of look at today. The first is in Ethiopia, in these remote villages. These are people who are way off the grid. Solar charging stations were put in so they could charge the tablets. This one is up in the mountains. This one is in the bush, where they're 10 kilometers from a water source and walk every day to get water. So it gives you some context of what the environment is like. In South Africa, in KwaZulu-Natal, this is a school, government school, where there's 50 to 100 kids per classroom, and teachers might have 6 months of training before they're put into the classroom after high school. So woefully underprepared. This is in the U.S. in rural Alabama. Kids surprisingly come to kindergarten with only an oral vocabulary of about 500 words. So the question is, how can we get them more prepared before they enter a good school system. Okay. So again, 3 different environments that we're looking at here. No school at all, under-resourced schools, and how do we get kids that can get to a good school but are nowhere close to ready for it by the time they get there up to speed. Okay. So a little bit about the methodology. We would hand out the tablets, and we didn't even tell them how to turn them on, just to see what happened. Okay. So this is a short video of the first few minutes in Roanoke, Alabama.
Turn this on.
Ryan.
Turn this on, Ryan. Oh, Ryan. How do you turn this on?
Play around with it. Ask your neighbor.
I know the orange.
Play around with it. See what you can do.
I'll turn it on.
I can turn it on.
Can you turn mine on?
Cadence. Good job.
How I'll turn it on?
Adriana.
How I'll turn it on?
Can you talk to your neighbor?
Mine on?
Brian.
Okay, what's really interesting here is not the kids that keep asking how to turn it on, it's the 2 girls in the back who are figuring it out, right? And just doing it on their own. And we universally found this, whether we were in the village in Ethiopia or in Roanoke County, Alabama, or in South Africa and many other places that we're now starting, have studies in, that within about 4 minutes, somebody figures out how to turn it on, and it spreads like wildfire through the group, okay? Even if they've never held a tablet or a mobile device before. So, okay, this is in South Africa. This is 20 minutes after they've had the device, okay?
So I'm just going to hold this.
So, as Tinsley explained to you, this particular video shows that within about 20 minutes, not only had the children explored essentially the huge bucket of apps that they had access to, but they had selected a particular app that they might want to focus on. And in this particular case, this child chose an app where he could practice tracing letters. And we happened to be in the room when that went on. And I remember one teacher kind of sitting in the background watching him trace these letters and saying to a teacher standing next to her that, oh my gosh, I had no idea he could write any of those letters. And look at him focusing. That's more time than he's ever focused in his entire life. So one of the things that I wanted to also emphasize about our approach is the need to scale this project means that as much as we appreciate the contributions that teachers make in the classroom, unfortunately, many of these children do not have access to that kind of a resource, either because they're in classrooms that are just too full, or because they are in places where there just simply are no teachers. So we needed to experiment with an approach that allows children to essentially guide their own learning process. So part of the question that we're asking is not just can children learn from these mobile devices, but can they learn during a process in which they're guiding their own learning activities? They themselves are deciding which apps they're going to play with and for how long they're going to play the apps. Now, in each one of these settings, the amount of time that the children have with the tablets is fairly different. So, for instance, in Ethiopia, in settings where the children don't have access to school, they're free to use the tablets when their day allows them. And interestingly enough, our data tells us that the kids use the tablets very early in the morning and very late in the evening. So their days are filled with lots of other activities. Now, in school settings, either in here, for instance, in South Africa, or in a preschool setting, they have kind of set times during the day, be it an hour a day in the in the preschool setting, or approximately 3 times a week in the South African setting for approximately an hour a day. What the kind of data that we collect basically falls in these 2 buckets, either on the level of literacy data or usage data. Now, literacy data is at the moment being collected either by means of standardized paper and pencil tests, so for instance the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test And the PALS kindergarten assessment tool is being used in U.S. sites, and we use modified versions of those tools in settings like South Africa and Ethiopia. And we were specifically interested in these 4 categories of literacy or pre-literacy knowledge: receptive vocabulary, letter identification means do they know the name of the letter? Letter sound is asking the children to tell you what sound is associated with a particular letter and whether or not they can read just some basic sight words. Now, on the level of usage data, we're collecting information regarding app launches, so which apps are the children choosing, how much time are they spending within each app. There are a few apps in our collection that have been outfitted with bits of code that allow us to see exactly what the children are doing, so basically taps within the apps. And then, of course, finally, we're also collecting information about device health. What's the battery life? Are the tablets communicating with our system? So if we look at some of the data, here in Ethiopia, we saw that after approximately 6 months with the tablets, we saw that there were actually just a very, very small subset of kids who did not know the subset of randomly selected words that we had chosen from the apps that they had been exposed to. But rather, there were a very large number of kids who knew somewhere between 7 to 11 of the words that we had chosen to test them on, and around half of the kids knew a very large number of words. And again, those words were just randomly selected, and they were very effective at being able to identify the meaning of those words. And similarly with letters. There were a very small subset of kids who knew only 2 to 7 letters, but there were a large number of kids, approximately half the kids who could identify after 4 months at least 8 of the letters, if not 12 or more of the letters. Now, keep in mind, there's a lot of data internationally telling us that children in places like Ethiopia, so for instance, Zambia is a well-known case in which children might go to school for 2 years and not be able to identify a single letter or be able to read a single word. So already after 4 months, the children using our tablets are learning just as well, if not potentially even better, than the children who are actually attending the Ethiopian schools. In South Africa, we were able to actually compare our kids to some actual control groups. So the 2 bars that are in red, those are the only groups that actually had the tablets. So as far as the number of words who are decoded by the end of 1st grade, granted, these differences are not very great, but the groups here are much larger. So the red bar, that's our group of kids of approximately 500 kids who had access to the tablets for at least 3 times a week. And they're being compared to either children in the first bar who were at the same school who had no tablet, or B, C, and D, those were children who also did not have access to the tablets but were at other schools. And we can see, while not a huge difference, because of the large number of children, a statistically significant difference between the kids who had the tablets and the children who did not have the tablets, both in the number of words that they could decode and the number of letters that they could identify. Our results in our preschool setting also tells us that in comparison to children who did not have access to the tablets but who were entering kindergarten, their kindergarten readiness skills were significantly higher than children who did not have access to the tablets. And in fact, in that second graph, we could see that the amount of time that children spent within apps was significantly correlated with the degree to which that they could name letters. So just to give you a little idea of what this looks like on the ground, this is Ethiopia. That's after a month, after 6 months. So just like with the knowledge of how to turn on the tablet, what we're seeing in all of our settings is that you have a very small number of high performers who learn very, very quickly, and then that knowledge within about 4 to 6 months spreads very quickly to the rest of the group. what we're finding is that the children, of course, are not just learning from the tablets, but they're also learning from each other. So what we believe is that we have stumbled upon or worked very hard to create a very effective tool for self-driven learning that seems to be able to work in a whole variety of settings. A significant percentage of our kids are reaching this benchmark of kindergarten readiness, and that's particularly interesting in places like rural Alabama, where the children don't have access to preschool, and kindergarten readiness is highly associated with academic achievement. The amount of time that children spend in an app is associated with a significant rise in letter naming. That shouldn't seem like such a great conclusion, except that that tells us that as app designers, we need to focus on this notion of how do we keep kids within the apps? How do we prevent them, keep our apps interesting enough so they don't want to hop all over the place or leave your app? And that children did acquire all the basic skills that we presented on the tablets. What prevented them from learning more is just that we don't have enough content in order to take them to the next step. So these pilot studies are already expanding to further places around the world. We're already moving to scale. So in addition to our Ethiopian, South African, and rural U.S. sites, we have 3 sites in India, a preschool in Uganda, and we are expanding in September to a very large deployment in Peru. And what we are seeking to answer is the next question, which is whether or not that 170 million kids who seem destined to join the large number of illiterate adults in the world, can we bring them even into basic literacy? And UNESCO estimates that just bringing children into very basic literacy, being able to write their names, being able to write a sentence about where they live and what they do, would represent, or could possibly lead to a 12% reduction in world poverty. Now, I know we're down to just a very few minutes for answering questions, so I'm just going to put this slide up here to show you the areas in which we are searching for partners, both deployment partners as well as technology partners, in order to bring what I think is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to change the world, to really bring that to scale. Thank you. Okay,
We actually have plenty of time for questions. I was showing you the time left in your talk.
There you go.
Also,
So
I'd like
it's
to
time
say
for-
that we want the questions to be on a microphone, so I'm going to come around, so don't start talking until you actually have the microphone.
Thanks for the presentation. Really, really interesting stuff. And I'm curious about sort of when the children first get the tablet, both about how curated your content is. Are there only 3 apps or 1,000 apps or whatever? And how, if they're pre-literate, that they choose which app to do. Is it just a random choice, or you have beautiful, attractive graphics? So I'm interested in both the initial choice and how you keep other apps off the tablet. I understand a lot of them, there's no connection. But in Alabama, I'm sure they've got Wi-Fi and so on. So how do those things happen?
Let me answer your second question, and I'll let Stephanie answer it first. We actually have our own custom launcher that only lets them see the apps we choose them to see. So the device is locked out, and there are about 30 to 40 apps on it. And I'll let Stephanie answer how those were chosen.
So my background is actually not in the technology field. It's in literacy development and linguistics. I've worked for many years with my colleague Marianne Wolf and others on the cognitive neuroscience around literacy, acquiring literacy. So it's with this background that we chose really, in essence, how the brain learns to read, that we chose apps that would promote the knowledge in these particular areas, and in particular, areas that are related to literacy. So our first step was looking for apps that at least hoped to promote knowledge in these areas. So areas like oral language, what children know about vocabulary, what they know about the alphabet, and this graph just grossly represents kind of the skills that children need to acquire to become literate at approximately a late first grade level. The red stars represent areas where we actually have apps that would promote knowledge in those areas. So you can see there's a lot of this, what we call the app map, that is largely unrepresented. Now, part of the reason why these areas might not be filled is because we are only using Android devices. So if an app is only on iOS, we can't use that app. And we also do have, we have to use apps that do not need internet access, so that, you know, closed out a small subset of apps. But what really eliminated some apps from our collection, or a large number of apps from our collection, is just that so many apps that are produced are just wrong. You know, so if they're only learning English from the tablets, and we can talk about the choice of language in a moment, but if they're only learning the English from the tablets, then it's, you know, pretty good for that. It would be best for that app to at least be correct in some way, shape, or form. And many, many apps are just not correct. So that gives you just a little bit of insight. And, you know, this is just a very brief list of some of the apps that we have on the tablet now. And then we have a much, much larger list that are apps that we've chosen from in the past. And ideally, we would have a large enough collection of apps that would allow us to kind of trade out the apps over time. You know, the dwell time, the usage information tells us that just because a child has stopped using a particular app doesn't mean that they've actually mastered that content. Sometimes the app is just now boring, and they still need to learn those letters, but they need to have another app to choose from. So then finally, just very briefly, how do they choose the apps? We don't have any pretty kind of guidance at this stage. We went in with kind of the lowest common denominator theory, which is, what if kids could just choose any app that they wanted to based just on their own exploration? And what we find is across sites, kids manifest a very similar pattern. So at first, of course, they're just doing probably what we would all do, which is open up every single app and go, do I like this? Do I not like it? Do I want to come back to it? After about 2 weeks, they tend to hone in on a subset of apps that they stay in for a longer period of time and that they repeatedly revisit. And then after about a month or 6 weeks, then they go through another, you know, burst of exploration. In other words, those apps have gotten boring and I need to find something new. So again, that tells us we need to keep feeding them with content and then monitor their learnings so that we can determine whether or not we're giving them content that meets them at their needs.
We have 5 more minutes for questions, but I'd like to ask the next speaker to go ahead and start setting up.
Hi, I'm Neil Effernan. My question is about actually maybe the baseline equivalence. Was there any baseline equivalence you were able to determine in either the South African case or the Alabama case?
Yeah, so the Alabama kids, we did have pre and post. So that particular testing range was for about 4 months. We saw at pre that the children showed no real statistically significant differences between themselves and kids who were in preschools where they didn't have tablets. But then at kindergarten entry, we could see a very large difference between them and the kids who also did not have access to the tablets. In Ethiopia, there was unfortunately no pre-data that was taken, but you know, the assumption is that they were largely at 0 for all of these skills. And in South Africa, we could see also that there was no real difference, but it's particularly in our first graders, which is a very large group. Our group is mostly first graders in South Africa. That the knowledge of these areas was at 0 essentially. So you know, our assessors give us the feedback that, well, the kids can't do the test, and they think that's a bad thing. But in essence, of course, that means that they just don't know this stuff. You know, that's our baseline is 0.
Hi, Armando Fox, UC Berkeley. This is really fascinating, great stuff. Thank you for the talk. I was particularly struck, and maybe it's just because I'm a little bit outside my area with respect to your material, about the consistent observation you said, where there's a small number of high-performing learners who get it right away, and then they catalyze spreading it very rapidly to the other students. Is there anything about the design of the apps you use, or have you thought about what design might be if you were going to target, if you're going to take advantage of that fact, if you knew that that's how the dynamics of learning were going to be, is there something that you do differently, or have the apps been designed with that in mind?
The apps have not been designed with that in mind. We're trying discussions about how could you create apps that aren't most of them are designed for people to use them individually. How do you use them as a group? How do you catalyze that kind of connection between each other? There's been a little bit of hint of people starting to explore that, but I don't know of any apps that are specific.
Just as a clarification, and this could be ignorance of a newbie, but is the observation that you made with respect to that, is that a novel observation? I mean, it accords comfortably with my anecdotal experience, but this is probably the first time I've heard it sort of empirically documented.
Right. Well, we've certainly seen it anecdotally through the video, and we're seeing it in the usage patterns too. So you can actually see, the way the apps, kids using particular apps, and it's starting with certain kids and then proliferating across tablets in certain ways. So there's certainly a lot more work to be done to analyze the data to fully understand what's happening there, but there's a lot of suggestion that that's potentially very rich. And it's not just kids who are the outliers who are learning it, but there are also other kids that are playing other roles. Facilitators, who are the ones who bring the information around. It's not necessarily the same kid that uses. So.
Yeah. And as far as your question about the novelty of this type of observation, I mean, certainly it's novel in the context of this kind of tech-based intervention. But certainly there's a lot of work that's been done, and I don't know if Professor Mitra will talk about that this afternoon at the keynote, but certainly a lot of his work has talked about these kind of open classrooms where children perform different roles as far as how the information spreads throughout the classroom. There are, your facilitators, there are your information spreaders, I can't remember, to be honest, all the terms that he uses, but I think what we're observing in our tech-based classrooms is a phenomenon that's very similar to what Professor Mitra has observed in his work also.
Thank you.
One extremely quick question.
It's not an extremely quick question. Yeah. Well, so the question is actually, so I find this really fascinating, but it also causes me sort of considerable cognitive dissonance, because this would contradict to some degree things that we've learned from the computer-supported collaborative learning and also research on self-regulation, namely that those things, when unsupported, are very difficult for kids. So the question is, how can we reconcile the two, or can't we? But that doesn't seem like an easy question.
Maybe at lunch we can talk about it. I think that's part of what we're exploring, is this notion, as someone who has, focused more on learning in this particular area of literacy, there are a lot of questions that this project raises around what areas can children learn easily on their own, and at what point will there come a time when either individual children or potentially groups of children may hit a wall without some kind of a facilitator. And so part of while we certainly are always thinking about those kids who do not have access to a school whatsoever, and how can we support the learning of those children, we also have to keep in mind these children who are in classrooms that have 50 to 100 children in them. How can we potentially make better use of the teacher's time so that all the children can get a high quality education, and so that her skills or his skills can be used more effectively?
Thank you so much.